I sat with many people experiencing all types of loss. I didn't have that power. I didn't have that authority to take away someone's pain. We're kind of aware of what we have, what's present, but the absence can be made even more powerful by the presence. Again, that's your grief. What's it doing for you? What's it doing to you? And how do we work with that? Can grief mold to you, or do you have to mold to grief? So why do we wait to the end? Like why do I wait to the end of my life to bring all my family and friends together?
Don't Be Caught Dead, the show bringing stories of death back to life. Here's your host, Catherine Ashton.
Today we have Bryan Petheram, a counsellor and group facilitator with Griefline, a national not-for-profit that has been supporting the community with free grief support and resources for more than 30 years. Thank you for being with us, Bryan.
Thanks, Catherine. Really nice to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Now tell me, Bryan, what attracted you to the role of being a counsellor at Griefline?
Well, I was attracted to Griefline, first of all, I guess, because of the work they do in the community. Grief and loss focused, really important. But in terms of being a counsellor in the grief and loss space, what attracted me to that role really was lived experience of grief and loss, my own, of course, but really a long time in a first response role with the police. I sat with many people experiencing all types of loss, and I observed many types of grief. And I kind of morphed into a counselling therapeutic space where I could sit with people for longer than I was able to in that different role and support them in their grief. And it's a real privilege. It's a real privilege to sit with people in their grief. So attracted to the role of working as a grief counsellor, and then attracted to Griefline because of the work we do in the community.
So what I might do is just take you back to that earlier role that you've had of being a police officer. What period was that, and what was your role?
Yeah, absolutely. So it was a 20-year period, started in the very late 90s into 20 years later. Lots of different roles, actually, mostly on the street, mostly in general duties, first response types of work. I also worked in the courts and a few different places, but primarily, that first response role. And it really, amazing sort of career, really worthwhile, challenging at times, absolutely. Yeah, from a grief and loss perspective, there was just so much of it that was, it was almost present daily, and not just bereavement, not just people dying, of course, but other types of losses. And I think as an early police officer, I kind of wasn't aware of what that actually meant. What is this grief that people have, and how are they responding? And, doesn't everyone respond in the same way, kind of thing? But as time went on and you saw more and more and became a bit more educated myself, and I guess more lived experience and grew up a little bit, I guess I saw that there are different ways to grieve, and that really interested me, which was already, I guess, an education around grief and loss, and we're continuing that journey now. And again, a real privilege sitting with people. I think as a police officer particularly, and the paramedics are very similar, aren't they, and other first responders, that often you're the first person who's present at the scene of a loss, if I can describe it that way. Of course, there's grief, there's that psychological first aid moment, but you're the very first person, and you're kind of holding this person emotionally, and sometimes feeling a bit lost in that space. How do we what do we do? How do we fix this? Was often the sense I had.
And that's interesting that you say that you felt as a first responder being in that position, how do I fix this? I think that from what I've seen from the outside looking in, when people are a first responder, they're very much inclined to want to fix or help solve the problem that they see in front of them. Would that be your perception from where you were?
Yeah, you put it really well, Catherine, that problem solving. Absolutely. I think as a police officer, and paramedics, again, I'm using them in the same vein. Yeah, there's a problem in front of you, and you do what you can to fix it as best you can, whatever that means and whatever is appropriate in those circumstances. And grief and loss, particularly, the deaths of people, was a space where I learned pretty quickly that I couldn't do that. I didn't have that power. I didn't have that authority to take away someone's pain. Yeah, it really troubled me over the years. And how do you teach? How do you teach that? How do you, as a police officer or any kind of profession, how do you teach? The ability to hold that space with strangers, and that's really what sort of inspired me into this space now, because I thought, hang on, I'm working with these strangers and I'm often the first port of call in relation to a significant loss. Of course, now as a grief counsellor, I'm well aware that we don't try to take away the grief. In fact, I don't want to take away someone's grief. It's the last thing I want to do. I don't want to rob them of that experience, but it's a different sense now because I've got time, a privilege of time to sit with people, sometimes for hours at a time, weeks and months at a time, a privilege I didn't really have in that other role, just because of the nature of the role, I guess, Catherine, they're different, aren't they? Yeah.
Very much so. And thinking of that timeline of the 90s when you first started, that was very much, from my understanding, where we were still thinking about grief as stages that you pass through, whereas you're in a position to tell me, from what my understanding is that we've moved past that thinking. Would that be correct, Bryan?
Oh, completely correct. Yeah. We don't forget that thinking. We acknowledge the emotions that were in that stage model, that those emotions exist, but we've certainly moved well past the idea of a stage model. Absolutely. And there are lots of different models we use today in our therapeutic work that are quite different from that. But we don't ignore the work that was done to create that model. It had a meaning and it was worthwhile, but, that model was could have created in 1969 and we're a bit older than that now. So we kind of know a bit more than I guess we might have then. But going back to that policing experience, I mean, there was simply no teaching of grief and loss. There was no kind of, even the 5-stage model, as we've just discussed, it wasn't even taught to us. So you kind of arrived on the scene of an incident and you worked it out from those before you that had done it. You learnt from others, I guess. Yeah, I think if I went back now, I'll probably annoy my colleagues a bit, but if I went back now with this grief knowledge that I've been lucky enough to accumulate, I don't know, I might sit with people a bit differently. Although I say that, but I mean, again, it's the privilege of time now, isn't it? I guess that's what we have. Yeah.
And the beauty of hindsight.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely.
We're always far more critical of our actions when we look back.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But even, Catherine, the conversation, and I know we might talk about it later on, but even the language used. I remember being an early police officer and you'd kind of walk into a house and you meant the absolute best, but you'd say things like, so how are you today? Or how are you going? Or just that the words we chose, because what else could you say? Reality, probably the best thing was to say almost nothing and just be there. And it's kind of a work in progress for all of us. How do we talk about grief and loss with those around us? Yeah, that's been a real lesson of mine, I can assure you.
And do you want to tell me a little bit more about that? Like, what are the changes that we have seen in relation to language, how we support, how we talk about grief, and the different models you now have in your toolbox to work with different people? Can you give me some sort of insight about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a good question. I think language is really important in our grief work. The language that we use as practitioners is really important. But the language that people who are in grief use, and that's a big part of our therapeutic work, is working with people to practice some language, how they speak about themselves, how they speak about their grief, how they speak about their loss. Really important. And I think some of the changes have been, I guess, a more direct way of speaking. Often we encourage people to be clear about what's happened. So maybe rather than, someone has passed away or moved on, we might actually use the word death or dying. Someone has died. And it sounds sort of a bit harsh, doesn't it? But that language is really important because it can help people to move to the level of acceptance of what's happened, that reality that they're now faced with. And then the language around ourselves, am I a widow or widower? Am I a bereaved person? How do we describe ourselves? And does grief define us? Is that identity that we've taken, does that define who we are now? Or is grief just part of us? So the words we use, I think, are important. And it's a big part of the work with people in a therapeutic, clinical sense to kind of practice some different languages, different words around how they speak about themselves in particular. And the models, I mean, there are quite a few different contemporary models we use. But I think to summarise them, if that helps, is they're mostly about a non-linear, non-straight line way of grieving. They're process-driven, so grief as a process, grief as, the movement through, I guess, some tasks of grief, things that as humans in grief we could experience, and how do we move through those moments. But we move back and forth. It's a non-linear sort of projection. There's a really good diagram that I've seen, and you can Google it, and it's an image of grief that's just chaos. It's lines from emotion to emotion, and it kind of counters that idea that whether we move through the tasks of grief or whether we move through the process of grief, that we have to do it in a straight line. And once people see that and realize that, hey, this thing is chaotic and the chaos that I'm experiencing is actually expected, gee, it makes a big difference for people. It gives them almost the freedom, if that's the right word, to experience their own grief. So I think, I know it's a quick summary, Catherine, but it's more process driven as opposed to prescripting in grief. I think is a big change that I've seen over the years.
What I find interesting about what you're saying, Bryan, is that label and that tendency for us to define ourselves as a particular person, a name, whether we are a widow or we're married. We seem to put a lot of pressure on ourselves to pigeonhole where we fit. Is that some of the challenge you have to work through with them?
Yeah, Catherine, a really good question. I think it's the greatest challenge. Absolutely. I think the greatest challenge for people in grief, besides the terrible heaviness and the pain of what they're experiencing and the sense of loss, of course, that probably goes without saying, but it's worth acknowledging, of course, that's important. But I think socially, I think, people in grief are often comparing themselves to others, either others they know or others they don't. They see people on social media or other forms of media. They hear from their family or community or their work colleagues that, hey, grief looks this way, but hold on, mine doesn't. So if mine doesn't look the way yours does, then is there something wrong with me? And that's a really powerful message that people are hearing in the community. And I guess that's part of the work we do at Griefline, particularly, is to, hopefully spread the message that your grief is your grief. Here are some common ways that people might grieve, but how are you grieving? That's really important. I've had many clients, Catherine, have come to me just as part of the team here at Griefline as a grief counsellor, and they've come because they have the message that their grief is not happening the right way. So they'll come to me and they'll say, hey, Bryan, I've come to you because I'm not grieving correctly and I want to learn how to grieve correctly, is essentially what often comes. Doesn't take very long to spend time with them hopefully for them to see that in fact they're grieving in the way that's right for them. Maybe there are some tweaks, maybe there are some things that we could think about doing differently or feeling different, or the use of language as we've discussed, of course, but often, almost invariably, their grief is okay for them. It's painful and heavy, absolutely, but they're doing the best they can in their own circumstances. Sometimes that comparison in grief happens when people have lost the same person. Someone in a family dies and siblings or partners or children, they'll grieve quite differently and they'll compare each other in the same home. Why is he or she back at work, or why is he or she eating well and exercising and sleeping and I'm not? Is there something wrong with me? We hope the message is, well, no, your grief is just different for lots of different reasons. And let's see how your grief shifts and changes, because that's what it will do, won't it? I often say to people, we meet today, your grief looks this way, but if we were meeting for the first time in tomorrow or 6 weeks or 6 months or 2 years, that your grief could look very different. I can't prescribe what that will be yet, but that idea that grief shifts and changes can give someone a sense of some sort of healing, hope for the future. But not to compare with the person next to you, but compare with your own grief, I guess, is the challenge, isn't it?
And from what you're saying, I'm assuming that there's not only societal pressures that we're having to deal with, but what you were mentioning about intergenerational issues, I'm assuming cultural, religious issues all play a part in how, I suppose, we perceive we should be responding when someone dies.
Absolutely. And that's that word, isn't it? Should. Again, returning to
Mm.
language, yeah, should is such a dangerous word in grief work. People use it all the time. I should feel this way, or should do this, or I should think this way. Yeah, sometimes we spend whole sessions in counselling erasing that word from the vocabulary if we can. Maybe not should, but could, I guess is a better word, isn't it? So you're right, all those societal messages that we receive, the construction of our grief and loss. But it's not just the grief itself, like how we should grieve, it's also what the loss is. So societal influences, yeah, cultural influences, family influences, and those intergenerational downward kind of messages from generations above us, absolutely. But they're also about loss too. Often people will have trouble acknowledging the significance of a loss in their life. I mean, bereavement and death of someone, that's, I guess, the most obvious and really significant. But other losses that can come from that or that can exist in our life, people will fail to acknowledge it, either because those in their community don't acknowledge it or they don't acknowledge it themselves. And then they're kind of left with this sense of, well, why do I feel this way? And sometimes the answer is, well, there's this loss that's not acknowledged. So the first step really is we acknowledge the loss. That's often, we're all different. That's how I might start a counselling session with someone. I'll just acknowledge what the loss is. And once we've done that, then we can look what the grief is. But the loss must come first. So it's really the first step. What is your loss? And what does this loss mean to you? What does it say about you? What does it say about your future? Where does it tie to your past? What does this loss actually mean? All those factors we've identified, or you've identified absolutely correctly, they do impact how we acknowledge the loss. Sometimes people will come to counselling, for example, because they feel there isn't the acknowledgement or the support of their loss within their community. So they come to an outsider, whoever that might be. It could be a formal counsellor, or it could be someone else in their community that they can talk to who does acknowledge the loss. I think one of the biggest challenges too, Catherine, is grief and loss can be disenfranchised by the community and by society. But sometimes we disenfranchise our own grief. We almost say to ourselves, I shouldn't feel this way. There's that word should again. And because I shouldn't feel this way, then I won't. It's a real challenge, I think.
And when you talk about loss, is it possible to give us some examples of what people mention as the loss that they experience?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's the loss of the person through death, of course, bereavement. That's, I guess, what people often think about when they think about grief, don't they? And that's really significant and important. Sometimes other losses can flow from that, though. So someone dies and someone's faced with that terrible loss and the real change and adjustment to their reality. Sometimes, that comes with financial pressure. Sometimes people have to move home, or they can't afford their rent or their mortgage if there is one. Sometimes they have to leave their job. Sometimes they lose other relationships because of the death. Siblings can kind of have a rupture when the parent dies, as an example. So all these other, what we call living losses, things and people that are still alive, we lose those as well. Sometimes people lose their sense of identity, going back to that sense of identity. Who am I now? I've lost a parent or a sibling or a friend. What does that mean for me? And who am I now? And that loss of sense of identity is really, really powerful. Loss of relationships. We use the word bereavement for the loss from a death, of course, but we can equally probably steal the term and apply bereavement to loss of relationships, loss of marriages, long-term relationships, loss of job. A lot of research on that. People lose their job and it's a sense of identity attached to their occupation. I know a lot of police, as an example, to go back that theme, when that career ends, there's a significant sense of loss because that they're tied to that identity as a police officer and they lose that. It happens in the military a lot, and there's real grief there. How do we start that work? Well, we say, well, what have you lost? And what does it mean to you? Why does this marriage mean something to you? Why does this house mean something to you? Why does this job mean something to you? Why does it matter that you're different than you used to be, that sense of identity? Why is that important?
And do you work on values when you go through that process? Because I know when I had my car accident and I had to give up my job, which I loved at the Royal Botanic Gardens as a producer in events. And I'd been there for 13 years. So it was my sense of community, it was my sense of purpose. But it took me 16 weeks in rehab to work out what my values were and therefore what I needed to satisfy to make me feel better again, I suppose.
Absolutely. Values is such an important place to spend time in, isn't it? Absolutely. Because if you work out the values, your values, then you can work out how valuable that role is. So for you, that important work was valuable to you in some form. Because I guess you could argue if there's no value in that, then the loss is less significant, I guess. Why does it feel painful to lose someone or lose something? Because it has value to me. And then from a values perspective, why does it mean something to me? You know, a job, for example, and maybe, I'm not sure, Catherine, yours could be that, I'm not sure, but, you know, a sense of purpose, contributing to others, you know, a sense of connection, you know, all those values that we espouse in our life are often taken away from us when we lose something or someone, you know. Yeah, family. I mean, you know, sometimes people have a sense of family, obviously, and when someone died in that family, they wonder about the sense of their family. Is this still a family? You know,
Yeah.
or does a family itself, is that lost? You know, so there's, yeah, I mean, it can be quite nuanced, can't it? But yeah, values are such an important part of the work, helping people acknowledge their loss again as that first step, we hope. Yeah.
And from what I've seen and what I've heard from people as well is that people that lose a pet or a companion animal, that they still feel that they have loss as well. And I know that you have a specific program for pet loss at Griefline. Talk us a little bit about how, you know, the loss of a pet or a companion animal, how that can impact someone.
Yeah, you're right. Griefline has some really valuable work in that space. A colleague of mine, Candice Mace at Griefline, yeah, she's produced some really good workshops in relation to pet bereavement. So significant, isn't it? And why? Why is that? Well, it speaks to relationship, doesn't it? You know, grief is the response to loss. Loss hurts. Why? Because the thing we lost, we have a relationship with. Whatever that relationship is important. Even problematic relationships can still result in a grief response. You know, we still grieve that person. So if we compare that to a close relationship, a bonded relationship, I mean, I'm a dog person. My dogs give me unconditional love every day.
Yeah.
So if we compare that to the kind of relationships we lose with our human people, you can see why it's so impactful, because, you know, these beautiful animals are so connected to us. They're so bonded to us. And yeah, we lose that sense of immediate connection, because that's what loss is, isn't it? It's the loss of proximity, the inability to phone someone or to pat my dog. It's that loss of proximity. Many people have an enduring sense of connection with their pets or with their people, absolutely, but it's the loss of proximity, to touch, to hug, those things I think is really powerful. Again, if a client comes and says, I've lost a pet, why do I feel this way? Part of the work is to help them see, well, this is significant. In fact, for some people, it's just as significant as other types of losses. Absolutely.
It's interesting because when you were talking about loss, I was thinking about a few things, and that was the habitual behaviour that came. I grew up in a family where my mother would receive a phone call from her mother every night at 7 o'clock. And when she died, it was such a loss at 7 o'clock every night because it's that habitual connection that was always there. And then another story when you were talking about loss was I profoundly felt it when my cat died because the house was so quiet when you'd walk into it and there was no animal to greet you or meow or, you know, we've since now got another cat and another dog. But it is that presence and that unconditional love that I find and that proximity that you talk about that was really impactful for me.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Absolutely. Makes perfect sense. That loss is absence. That's what loss is the absence of something. We're kind of aware of what we have, what's present, but the absence can be made even more powerful by the presence. So I walk into my home and my beautiful cat's not there. I'm aware of that absence, and that makes it really, really powerful. Yeah, that habituation is really interesting. I mean, I can imagine potentially your mother going towards the phone at 7 p.m. in those weeks, months afterwards. I can imagine that. Yeah, the brain kind of says, "Hey, the phone's coming." Look, I can, lots of different stories, aren't there, like that? I've known people who maintain, a mobile phone contract when we used to have them of the person who has died. They keep paying the contract and they keep the phone. Why? Because they want to have the ability to call. It might seem odd to some people, but for that person, it really works. Even for a few weeks, a few months, ultimately we might do some work with that. But it's not unusual for those kinds of really powerful sort of ways of just hoping for some connection. I've known people that, for a few weeks, few months, still set a table, place at the table. They put a knife and fork and plates out. They still do it. We might spend some time on that a bit later on and have some conversations around that, but we certainly wouldn't judge it. Absolutely not. Again, that's your grief. What's it doing for you? What's it doing to you? And how do we work with that? Can grief mold to you, or do you have to mold to grief? Do I have to change my entire being because of grief? I've got to change some things probably. I've got to adjust to this new reality, but I wonder if grief can mold to me a bit. Yeah, the whole idea of grief styles, what's my style of grief? Maybe different to yours, Catherine. Neither of us are right, I guess, necessarily.
And that's interesting to think, because when I think that not long ago, there was a very strong cultural reason to wear black when you were mourning. And that wasn't that long ago, and I'm sure that's in some cultures still appropriate. But so we've always, had that challenge about how does it define me, and what do I change for grief, and then what does grief change for me? So I find that really fascinating, that it's a struggle that you have to work through with people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, I think it's worth acknowledging that none of this is easy, and we certainly, even in therapy and counselling, we might use words, and they're just words, aren't they? They're concepts and ideas. The person in grief is the one doing all the work. Absolutely. But, sometimes having a bit of a perspective on grief, kind of seeing what this grief is actually doing. We think about grief as stress, of course, the shock to the body, the shock to the brain, shock to our psychology. But for some people, grief can be seen as a healing. This is a healing of that terrible wound that the loss has caused. It's painful because it's healing. That's why it's painful, And for some people, that really helps because they can kind of see a function in this grief. Like, it must be worth something. I wouldn't go through this terrible time if it wasn't worth something. It must have meaning. Maybe we can construct the meaning a little bit, but it must have some meaning, I think, is a message that some people really take quite strongly from grief work. I think the other thing, I guess, about the message around loss and grief is that, where you are today and your sense of grief in your own world might define you today, and that's okay. But yeah, I wonder, for some people, they grow from grief. Some people take grief, and I'm kind of thinking that this great podcast that you produce might be part of that story. You take some grief and you go, I want to do something with that. Whether I create a wonderful podcast like this one, whether I plant a tree in my backyard, whether I try something different in my life, I'm not sure. It's different for everyone. But some people take grief and they do something with it as a way of saying, well, again, this must be worth something. What can I do with this grief? Maybe not the early stages, and maybe not for everyone, and maybe not always, but it's something that I see quite often. It's remarkable the way people use their grief for good, I guess, to put it that way, Catherine. Yeah.
And I know for me, part of the healing process has been about reconnecting with my values, and making sure what I could personally do was something that could help others, because I don't think anyone should ever experience that uncertainty in a very vulnerable time.
Yeah. Oh, it's just the thought came to me. Worked with a client recently, and it reminded me of some research we've done, and it spoke about the idea that death can guide us. So we know death's coming. So for some people, that can kind of frame our life. It can kind of give us this motivation and drive to do something with the time we have, because that's all we have is this time. So that can be a real driver. And grief can be a driver too for some people. They experience a loss of someone important, of course, and they go, well, hang on, I'm still here. So how do I honor this grief and do something with it? Yeah, I do see that a lot. I've seen it with, in my personal life, and I've seen it in my professional life. Not easy to do, and again, not for everyone, but you do see it. And often as a grief counsellor, I watch people do remarkable things, and I wonder to myself, I wonder if there's grief driving that. And often there is.
It's interesting because each loss is totally unique, as is each grief. And I lost my father nearly 11 years ago, and that didn't cause me to have a podcast. So it really is dependent on so many variables around that time, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And grief will come when it comes, and it will have a different message. That's right. Different age, different development, different, development stage of our life. I mean, we're all growing up, aren't we? Every day.
Yeah.
Catherine, I lost a very dear friend of mine just 2 weeks ago. His name is Frank, psychologist, remarkable man. And we visited him in the hospital right at the end, had the privilege to spend some time with him. And what did he do? He brought his entire family. He invited them all in from all different parts of the world, essentially, and said, be together. He sort of molded relationships and repaired relationships with his own children and with extended family. An incredible kind of moment for him and his family that we had the privilege of observing a little bit outside. And as I got in the car and left the hospital, knowing that was the last time I'd see Frank, I thought to myself, why do we wait to the end? Like, why do I wait to the end of my life to bring all my family and friends together? Why don't I do it every day? I mean, that's the message, isn't it? I know Frank would have, if he could have. He had the opportunity to do it right at the end. And I'm so grateful that he could do that for him and his family. But that's part of the privilege of this work, I think, is hearing the stories of people's loss and saying, hang on, I'm going to take a message out of that. I'm going to make my life worthwhile and bring my family together. Do I always do it? Well, probably not well enough, to be honest with you, Catherine, but I think that's the message from other people's grief. It must be worth something. Frank's pain had to be worth something. How do I, as his friend, make it worth something in my life? Work in progress, but yeah, interesting, isn't it?
It is. And like you were saying, though, is that your grief seems to change as you get older. Would that be like I would grieve in one way when I experienced the death of my grandmother or grandfather when I was younger, but then I would experience grief very differently now as a 46-year-old woman and a mother and a wife. And so is grief and how we respond to grief and loss constantly evolving? Like it doesn't always come in this particular package, like for me personally?
Yeah, I think so. I think package is a good word. I like the word you use. Yeah, I think it does come in different packages depending on different stages of our life, and also the relationship and social context in which we live. Maybe, I'm not sure, but when you lost your grandparent, you're obviously younger, and maybe life looked different then. If the same thing happened today, sadly, it would look different again because you're a bit older and there's this podcast and your family, and life looks different. So grief is just part of your life, of course, and it exists within the context in which we live, and your context changes every day. So absolutely, grief does look different for different age groups or for different people at different times. I wonder too, we do a lot of work with younger people, I guess, young adults. Sometimes, as sad as their grief is, they're not necessarily thinking about their own mortality. Sometimes they are, of course, but I don't see that as commonly. Whereas an older person who loses someone, often the conversation often shifts to their own mortality. If they could die, hey, maybe I could. I often see that. It's generalising, of course, but so that's an age difference, I think. maybe as people get older, maybe they do experience more grief just in terms of people around them that are older too. I guess that can happen. I think that the person who dies too, I mean, sometimes we can almost reconcile the reality of what's happened because of someone's age. We can kind of say, look, this is terribly sad and heavy and really impactful, but I kind of expected it to happen at some point. Whereas someone much younger who dies, well, it's a different reconciliation, isn't it? Because we think this should never have happened. So I think that's another part of our journey too, and how we might respond along the way.
And that makes me think about, based on that concept of how we reconcile it, can sometimes inform how we respond to it verbally. And one incident that I think of an interview that I had recently was with a woman who her child had died, or baby had died, and had not been gone to full term. And she was told, oh, well, at least you have another child. So it's interesting about that human way in which we reconcile death and how we, again, come back to value about where we place that on the scale, and then how that informs, I suppose, our language around it. So with that in mind, what do you recommend to people, Bryan, about their language when they're around someone who's grieving?
Yeah, really good point. I'm not sure where I read it, Catherine, but I read it somewhere recently that nothing good ever starts with the word at least, because you're immediately minimizing someone's experience. And you're right, these platitudes that we use are probably with good intention, but they can be quite damaging, I remember when my uncle died, my dear uncle, and I remember speaking to an employer at the time of mine and explained what happened, and their response was, well, at least it wasn't your father, and it wasn't my father. He was right. But the at least didn't help me at all because my uncle still died. I mean, so it's those words are language really important. I guess, to generalize, I guess my tip, if that's the right word, would be not to try to take away the pain, to not try to choose words that you think are going to make the situation better, because in reality, you probably can't. And by doing so, by trying to do so, or with the best intentions, well, it may not land very well, potentially. Things like, I don't understand exactly how you feel. It must be really, really difficult. I can see how difficult it is for you. I can see you're in pain. Sort of acknowledging that pain, I'm here for you, or I'm going to do something practical for you. I'm going to go and do that work for you, or whatever it might be. Rather than try to take away the pain, just be present. And Griefline has this great tagline. One of them is, be present, not perfect. And that's the message. Just be present, just be there, rather than try to take it away. Because those platitudes are really dangerous, I think, or can be. I think people often say things too, Catherine, like, I know how you feel. I've got a real dislike for that line, because I want to say, well, no, you don't. You may have a grief story of your own, absolutely, and I can see you trying to be empathetic, absolutely, but you don't know their grief because only they had the relationship with that person. Only they did. No one else did. So, yeah. And I guess if you're going to be present, if you're going to say to your dear friend who's lost someone special, I can see how painful this is. I'm here. I guess my encouragement would be to be there because often we see it, don't we? Where people are early stages of grief, or early phase of grief, when someone's just died, everyone's around. People are cooking meals and mowing lawns and washing cars and all sorts of things. And then the days and weeks go on and months go on. I see it with my clients, those that I work with for weeks, months, I see the difference. They often report the early stages, lots of support. And then as the weeks and months go on, the visitors are just less and less. So rather than try to say the right things, just try to be there, I guess, is the encouragement. And be prepared for that answer. I mean, if I say to someone, how are you today? Be prepared for the answer that may not be, I'm fine, thanks. It may be something different. And are you sort of emotionally ready for that right now? Are you psychologically prepared for that response for someone's grief? If you're not, that's okay. Maybe ask that question a bit later on. So many platitudes, Catherine. I mean, there's so many examples up there. And I think also they're done with good intention, aren't they? I don't think anyone goes out to
Yeah.
kind of, want to hurt people more, if that's possible. I think they just don't get the grief, because how can you? You're not in that grief story. There's a real difference between sympathy and empathy, isn't there? You can feel sorry for someone, and that's kind of nice, but it can kind of diminish them. It can kind of make the person feel lesser, like there's something wrong with me. You're feeling sorry for me, Empathy is far better if you can get it,
It's interesting that you use those two words, because for me personally, like you were just telling the story about Frank, I'm not about to say sorry to you. And I've only realised that since I've started doing this job, and I feel really uncomfortable to say to people when their loved ones died, I'm sorry, that you're experiencing that, or I'm sorry to hear that. I just stop, because I don't know whether I should be sorry or I shouldn't be sorry, because they may be pleased. I don't know what their relationship is or what they're thinking. So I've now gone for I don't say anything.
Yeah.
Or what I do say is, well, how are you? Is there anything I can do to support you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I can see the distinction there. You've made a clear distinction. That's right. And even if the person is, special to them, and let's assume that's often the case, of course. Yeah, I'm sorry for you can kind of diminish the person, but then doesn't do anything else. It's almost like I feel sorry for you, then I walk away, and you kind of think, well, thanks very much. Your sympathy didn't really help me.
I feel it's me projecting onto them so I feel better.
I think you're on spot on there. I think that's quite common. Again, with a good intention, I think. And some people might say, I've had people say, "Oh, I don't mind that, because at least I know people are thinking of me," and there's something in that. We're all different. We all do things differently, and I'm not saying this is the right way to do it. But when I begin some time with a client in a grief, I'll never say, "I'm sorry for your loss," ever. I'll always say, "I acknowledge your loss." I acknowledge.
Yeah, that's a nice way.
Just to hold that for a moment. And quite often it's responded to quite openly. Sometimes people say, no one's ever said that. No one's actually acknowledged what this loss is. That it can open that conversation. Catherine, I really respect what you did earlier on this point. You used Frank's name. Thanks for remembering that, but thanks for using it. And that's a really important message. If someone has experienced a significant loss, maybe one thing you could do is be open to sharing the story. I'd like to know about him. Yeah, but if you feel you'd like to, tell me about him. That kind of sharing of grief, of the grief story, can on its own merits be very therapeutic, even with friends and family. Do you mind if I use his name? Is it okay if I talk about him? Would you like to talk about him? Those kinds of, that can be a really helpful strategy as well, rather than, again, I feel sorry for you and I do nothing else, Yeah, be open to that conversation. Often people in their own family, I'm not sure, you may have experienced this, I'm not sure, but often people in their own circle, they have the sense that, we've talked about it too much almost. Like they have this sense that I can't keep talking about this person because people are sort of, they've done it and they want to break from it. So by talking about with someone else outside my circle, I've got this freedom to keep sharing. That might not be an accurate perception, an accurate reality. People may not be sick of talking about it, but that might be their perception. So being a person that someone can say, hey, let's talk about Frank, or let's talk about whoever, I think can be quite a nice way to be supportive. Again, returning to my mate Frank, I know that there are people in his community who went and kind of, I think, mowed lawns and took his trash to the tip, and, they didn't have to say anything. They were just there. And you could argue that's probably more powerful. But I think also, I guess, to carry that point along, Catherine, too, maybe we would rather someone says something than to be so afraid that they don't do anything. I guess there's that risk too, isn't there, that someone might say, I won't approach Bryan or Catherine, I won't even make a phone call or send a message because I don't want to say the wrong thing. So because of that, again, with the right intentions, I'll just stay right away from them. That could probably be just as damaging. Work out the balance in between somewhere.
Yeah, I have heard a story whereby a woman was walking down the street and a neighbour crossed the road because they'd had a loved one die, and obviously they felt uncomfortable and didn't know what to say. But the thing that stuck in the woman's memory was that person that was a neighbour that crossed the road. And again, I think sometimes what you were saying about intentions, sometimes they can be misunderstood or not land where you expected them to land.
Yeah, that's true, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely.
And tell me, Brian, when does someone who is supporting someone who has lost a loved one, at what point in time do we sort of need to talk to them about maybe going and seeing someone about getting support? What are the sort of, I suppose, unhealthy, for want of a better term, to be displaying grief that may need support?
It's a really good question. Yeah, really good question. And probably not a question with a completely clear, direct answer, to be honest. I guess one way to answer that would be that the support from a counsellor's perspective is likely to be different at different points. So, if someone came, say, to our service, Griefline, for example, within a few weeks of someone dying, we're holding space for them. We're probably, helping them in a psychological first aid, helping with a heavy emotion, helping just navigate the next 10 minutes kind of sense. A few months down the track, we're probably moving into a more traditional, if I can use that word, sort of counselling relationship where we're exploring thoughts and feelings and we're working out how to navigate heavy emotions and still navigate our life, I guess. So there's a distinction about when someone may come to a form of therapy, absolutely. There's some thinking that, to move into a grief counselling space, we're probably coming in best about 6 months in. That's some thinking, because by that stage, we've probably got a good idea of what our grief is doing, what our grief looks like, and then we can actually spend some time with a counsellor or psychologist or social worker knowing what our grief looks like and kind of help navigate from there. Whereas if we come a bit earlier, very welcome to do that, but we don't always know what grief looks like yet because it's such early stages. And as you know, you're kind of navigating the practical parts of grief too. So it's different for everyone, absolutely. And, I think in a therapeutic space, what would tend to happen is, if someone came to our service or another service, we would just, I guess, help them assess where the grief's up to and then frame some support around that. It might be that someone comes today and has a couple of sessions and we talk through what grief looks like now, and then we might schedule something for a few months down the track, come back then, and then we'll see what has changed in our grief. Again, very individual, isn't it? There is the concept in grief work of stuckness, being stuck in our grief. And that generally talks to, significant impairment on our life and sort of a yearning for the person that is continuing in such a way that's so heavy that we're stuck. And I know it's not a very clinical word, but it's a word we use. So I guess that's the measure often for people, am I navigating the everyday as best I can as well as grieving? Then we're doing the best we can. If the everyday is so impaired that it's just not functioning, but grief's still there, well, then maybe it's the everyday and the grief that we need to bring into counselling to talk about. I mean, not everyone needs grief counselling, absolutely not. Some people navigate their grief through the social support, through their own sense of what they do, through workplaces, all different types of things. But if you feel like you're stuck and the grief is not shifting or changing, then yeah, that's the encouragement to think, okay, maybe I could talk to someone about being stuck, I guess, and see what we can navigate through. Or the other thing too is if there's no one in your community that you can talk to about your grief, well, that's an option for counselling too, because it doesn't have to be a therapeutic space. It can just be a space to sit and talk, if I can put it that way. So, if someone's alone in their grief, it feels isolated in their grief, which is really common, maybe think about talking to someone about that isolation. That's really important too.
And I suppose the other thing that comes to mind for me is then the aspect of if there's showing behaviours of self-harm or anything along that line, obviously reaching out and seeking support then.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, of course, absolutely. And we would always encourage people, if you have those sort of feelings of self-harm or suicidal ideation, anything of those nature, absolutely go to your GP, reach out to a psychologist, reach out to us at Griefline. And, those people will work out the best way to support someone. An example might be that, you may be experiencing certain feelings and thoughts, and that might be best sort of managed, medically, maybe, through your GP or a psychologist as an example. And then you may come to us a bit later on for some grief work. That often happens. So, yeah, be open to seeking that support. Griefline will assess, what might work best for you, and we'll either keep you with us and work well with you, or we might refer you to another service depending on suitability. Other encouragement, I guess, is if you are going to seek some help and you have experienced significant loss, whoever that help seeker is, whoever they are, and there's lots of people out there that can help, ask the question, do you work with grief? Do you have a sense of grief? Because some people just don't work in that space, and that's okay. Ask the question, just so you know that you're walking in with that kind of theme sitting there, if that's what's working for you. Of course, grief intersects with other things, doesn't it? Grief intersects with people's existing mental illness diagnosis or their physical illness diagnosis. It intersects with all of that. So it could be that someone is best served by helping manage that first, and then the grief comes secondary, if I can put it that way. Or we work concurrently and do a bit of both at the same time. But yeah.
And what I found, what you were just saying there, Bryan, the importance of finding someone who specialises in grief.
Yeah.
I made sure that I found someone who specialises in trauma.
Yes.
After I had my car accident, and the difference that it makes to actually have someone who's an expert in that particular area is just amazing. And I think, the services that Griefline offers is really quite diverse, isn't it? So you've got everything from online communities to groups to the number to call. You've also got a specific over 50s line, is it?
Yeah, at the moment, absolutely. So Griefline has lots of things. You're right. There's a helpline every day of the year, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Free service. You can call it many times as you like, and you'll be connected with a really well-trained volunteer who has training in grief and loss support. Some people call that line several times a day, or twice a week, or once a month, whatever it might be. So that's a really good service. Attached to that is a callback service where you can actually book in a time with one of the helpline staff. That's a really good service. Online forums, and we have a sort of nationwide group support groups that we run. They run every week, a couple of times a week, and then we have, in certain areas, we have our individual counselling as well that we do one-on-one, and that does depend on where you are a little bit. But I certainly encourage people, griefline.org.au, because you can look at all the resources, and you can always call and say, hey, this is what's happening for me, and the people at Griefline will help guide you to whether one of our services fits well, or another service that might be more in line with what's happening for you. Some really good resources too, like paper resource, resources you can access, download and read about. Yeah. And look, it could be that someone comes to Griefline for one session. They have a session with a counsellor, they talk about the grief, they navigate a little bit, and that's it. That's okay. Others will stay for, quite a while, but it depends on the person, and the circumstances. But reach out. I guess that's the message, isn't it? Reach out if you think that this is heavy enough that it warrants it. It's going to be heavy, but is it impacting you so much that, maybe some support to navigate that might be helpful?
Yeah, and I was just looking up while you were speaking, Bryan. It's the amazing book that you can download, and it's actually talking to exactly what we've discussed today, and that's How to Support a Grieving Friend, and that's the ebook that Sal and Em, who I believe are your ambassadors from Good Morning, the podcast and the book, they have developed that, and that is an exceptionally good resource, and we'll also have that on the show notes this episode as well.
Fantastic. Yeah, and there are lots. It's a fantastic. The Good Morning podcast is brilliant. They do so well at just communicating about grief, and I think that's kind of the message, isn't it? And that's what we're doing today. We communicate about grief to sell the message that it's worth talking about. It's a universal experience. We will all experience grief of some form at some point in our life. I guess that's almost a guarantee. Not necessarily death-related grief. It could be anything, as we've discussed. But if we can talk about it and share how we're feeling, well, that's part of the journey. And it doesn't have to be anything intimate. You don't have to tell someone exactly how you feel. It could just be, look, there's grief around today. Grief's here. Grief's heavy. That might be enough for someone to hear that message and just be able to provide that support that we've spoken about. Yeah, fantastic.
Well, I can't thank you enough for your time today, Bryan, and the personal stories you've shared and the advice that you've given. Thank you so much.
Catherine, thanks so much for having us. I hope it's helped in some way, and it's a real privilege to talk with you.
Thank you.
Don't be caught dead forgetting to subscribe. And here are some more videos we know you'll love.